You are sitting in a crowded coffee shop, surrounded by dozens of people, yet you feel completely invisible. The barista calls out orders in a mechanical rhythm. Customers tap frantically on keyboards. Conversations buzz around you like background noise from a movie you are not part of. Your phone buzzes with notifications from social media, showing you hundreds of connections, but none of them feel real. You scroll through endless feeds of other people's lives, each post a carefully curated window into experiences you are not part of, relationships you do not share, moments of joy that seem to exist in a parallel universe where connection comes easily. A couple at the next table laughs together over shared memories while you sit alone, pretending to be busy, pretending this solitude is a choice rather than a sentence. This is not just your story. This is the story of millions of people living in what should be the most connected era in human history. We carry devices that can instantly link us to anyone on the planet, yet we have never felt more alone. We live in cities with millions of neighbours, apartment buildings where hundreds of people sleep within yards of each other, yet we do not know the names of the people who live next door, have never shared a meal with them, would not recognise them if we passed them on the street. Something has gone terribly wrong with the human experience of connection. What we are witnessing is not simply a social trend, a temporary cultural shift that will correct itself with time, or the natural growing pains of technological progress. 1 in 6 people worldwide is affected by loneliness, with significant impacts on health and well-being. This represents nearly 1.5 billion human beings walking through their daily lives carrying the weight of profound isolation, feeling fundamentally disconnected from the web of relationships that should give life, meaning and purpose. But here is what makes this crisis even more devastating, what transforms it from a social problem into an existential emergency. Loneliness is linked to an estimated 100 deaths every hour, more than 871,000 deaths annually. To put this in perspective, loneliness now kills more people than car accidents, drug overdoses, diabetes, or many forms of cancer. We are facing an epidemic that is literally killing us, one broken heart at a time, one severed connection at a time, one day of isolation that leads to another until the accumulation becomes unbearable. Yet this epidemic remains largely invisible, hidden behind the facades of successful careers, busy social calendars and carefully managed online personas. Unlike other public health crises, loneliness does not announce itself with dramatic symptoms that send people rushing to emergency rooms. There are no telltale physical markers, no obvious signs that would prompt friends and family to intervene. It creeps into lives quietly, disguised as independence, rationalized as focus on career or self-improvement, masked by the constant stimulation of digital entertainment and social media engagement. People suffering from profound loneliness often appear to others as successful, connected and fully engaged with the world around them. They show up to work, attend social gatherings, participate in online conversations, maintain the external rhythms of a connected life, while internally experiencing a growing emptiness that seems impossible to communicate or resolve. The pain is carried internally, a secret wound that grows deeper with each superficial interaction. Each failed attempt at genuine connection, each night spent alone, wondering why relationships that seem so effortless for others feel so impossible to achieve. This is not a simple story about needing more friends, spending less time on social media, or joining more clubs and activities. The loneliness epidemic runs much deeper than surface-level social behaviors or individual lifestyle choices. It touches the very foundations of what it means to be human, what it means to exist in authentic relationship with others, what it means to find meaning and purpose in a shared world that increasingly feels fragmented and alienating. It challenges our most basic assumptions about progress, technology, individual freedom, and the nature of human flourishing. To understand this crisis, we must journey into both the latest scientific research that reveals how loneliness literally rewires our brains and the deepest philosophical insights about human nature that have been developed over centuries of human reflection. We must examine how the great existentialist philosophers understood the fundamental human need for authentic encounter, how phenomenologists revealed the intersubjective foundations of consciousness itself, how social theorists diagnosed the alienating effects of modern life long before social media existed. We will explore how loneliness creates neurological patterns that trap us in cycles of negative thinking and social withdrawal, making the very connections we crave feel increasingly threatening and impossible. We will discover how our modern world has systematically destroyed the social, cultural and spiritual conditions that make genuine human connection possible, replacing them with systems of interaction that simulate intimacy while delivering isolation. We will uncover the cognitive patterns that perpetuate loneliness and the therapeutic interventions that have shown promise in breaking these cycles. But most importantly, we will uncover pathways forward that can heal not just individual loneliness, but the collective forgetting of what it means to be human together. We will learn from philosophers like Martin Buber about the difference between relating to others as objects to be used and encountering them as irreducible subjects worthy of our full presence. We will explore Emmanuel Levinas's radical vision of ethics as the foundation of human relationship, Hannah Arendt's insights about the human condition of plurality, and Martin Heidegger's understanding of our fundamental being with others. We will discover that healing the loneliness epidemic requires not just individual therapy or social policy changes, but a fundamental transformation in how we understand human nature and the conditions necessary for authentic relationship. Part 1. The Invisible Wound. Let me tell you about Sarah, though that is not her real name. She is 32 years old, living in a studio apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, working as a marketing executive for a Fortune 500 company that manages brands you would recognize from every commercial break. Her Instagram feed shows a life that looks enviable to the 800 followers who double-tap her carefully composed photos, dinner parties with colleagues at trendy restaurants, weekend trips to the Hamptons where she poses in flowing dresses against sunset backgrounds, professional achievements celebrated with champagne toasts in glass-walled conference rooms overlooking the city. She has mastered the art of curating a life that appears full, successful, and deeply connected. But every night, Sarah comes home to her 800-square-foot apartment and sits in a silence that feels deafening, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. She kicks off her heels, changes into sweatpants, opens a bottle of wine that she will finish alone while scrolling through her phone, looking at the lives of people she barely knows, feeling more disconnected with each swipe upward through the endless feed of other people's carefully staged happiness. She has not had a meaningful conversation with another human being in weeks, not the kind of conversation where you reveal something real about yourself, where you risk being seen and known rather than simply performing a socially acceptable version of who you think you should be. When her mother calls from Ohio, Sarah finds herself making excuses to keep the conversation short because she cannot bear the effort of pretending everything is fine, of manufacturing enthusiasm for a life that feels increasingly hollow despite its external markers of success. The questions feel intrusive, even though they come from love. When will you settle down? Are you happy? Do you have friends in the city? Are you taking care of yourself? Sarah has become expert at deflecting these inquiries with updates about work projects, vacation plans, the latest restaurant she tried, anything to avoid the truth that she feels fundamentally alone in a city of 8 million people, that her days are filled with interactions that feel scripted and superficial, that she has forgotten how to be genuinely intimate with another human being. Sarah is not alone in her aloneness, though the irony of that phrase captures something essential about the nature of this epidemic. 30% of adults say they have experienced feelings of loneliness at least once a week over the past year, while 10% say they are lonely every day. This means that in any given week, roughly 100 million Americans are walking through their lives carrying the burden of significant loneliness, going through the motions of work and social obligation while feeling fundamentally disconnected from meaningful human contact. In any given day, 33 million Americans wake up knowing they will spend another 24 hours in profound isolation from the kind of relationships that give life meaning, purpose, and emotional sustenance. But the raw numbers tell only part of the story, the quantifiable surface of a phenomenon that runs much deeper into the fabric of how we have chosen to organize modern life. The deeper tragedy is how loneliness has become normalized, even expected, as a natural byproduct of adult independence and professional success. We have created a culture that celebrates self-reliance to the point of isolation, that mistakes busyness for fulfillment, that confuses digital connection for human intimacy, that treats depth of relationship as a luxury rather than a necessity for psychological and physical health. We tell ourselves stories about how modern life requires sacrifice, how career advancement demands focus that leaves little time for the slow, patient work of building and maintaining close relationships. Walk through any major city and you will see the physical manifestation of this cultural transformation. We have built urban environments designed for efficiency rather than encounter. Cities optimized for moving people quickly from one private space to another without the inconvenience of unplanned interaction. Apartment buildings where neighbors live for years without speaking. Office complexes where colleagues interact primarily through email even when they sit 20 feet apart. Restaurants where diners stare at screens instead of engaging in conversation. Public spaces designed to discourage lingering or spontaneous community formation. The architecture of modern life systematically eliminates the conditions that historically made serendipitous human connection possible. Consider how different this is from the way human beings lived for most of our species' history. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small groups where every face was familiar, where survival depended on cooperation and mutual support, where social exclusion meant death and community membership meant life. Our brains evolved in environments where loneliness served an adaptive function, creating psychological discomfort that motivated individuals to repair damaged relationships or seek new social connections before isolation became life-threatening. The pain of loneliness was meant to be temporary, a signal that prompted action rather than a chronic condition that people learned to endure. But in the span of just a few generations, we have created living conditions that would be almost unrecognizable to our ancestors, conditions that trigger our evolved loneliness responses without providing the traditional pathways for resolution. We live surrounded by strangers in numbers that overwhelm our capacity for personal relationship, work in organizations too large for genuine community, move frequently enough that we never develop deep roots in particular places, and rely on technologies that simulate social connection while delivering social isolation. The result is that millions of people experience chronic activation of psychological systems designed to motivate temporary social repair, but in contexts where such repair feels impossible or overwhelming. The youngest members of our society are bearing the heaviest burden of this transformation, a fact that should alarm anyone concerned about the future of human relationship and social cohesion. Between 17 and 21% of individuals aged 13 to 29 years old reported feeling lonely, with the highest rates among teenagers. Think carefully about what this means for a moment. Nearly 1 in 4 young people, those who should be in the prime of social exploration and relationship building, those whose developmental task should be learning how to form intimate bonds and navigate complex social environments, are instead experiencing chronic isolation during the most formative years of their emotional and social development. These are the people who grew up with social media, who have never known a world without instant digital connection to peers around the globe, who can video chat with friends on other continents and share their thoughts with hundreds of followers at any moment of the day or night. Yet they are more lonely than any generation in recorded history, more socially anxious, more likely to report feelings of depression and hopelessness, less likely to date, marry, or form the kinds of committed relationships that previous generations took for granted. The tools that promise to bring us closer together have somehow created a generation that feels more separated than ever before, more afraid of vulnerability, more confused about how authentic intimacy develops and sustains itself over time. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who served as Surgeon General of the United States, has compared the health impacts of loneliness to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. But this comparison, while striking, does not capture the full scope of how social isolation affects human well-being. Smoking damages your lungs and cardiovascular system. Loneliness damages your entire sense of self, your capacity for trust, your ability to imagine a future worth living, your fundamental faith in the possibility of human connection. It rewires your brain in ways that make the very relationships you crave feel increasingly threatening and unattainable. When researchers study the brains of chronically lonely people using functional magnetic resonance imaging, they find alterations in regions associated with threat detection, reward processing, and social cognition. The lonely brain becomes hypervigilant for signs of rejection, interpreting neutral social cues as evidence of disapproval or disinterest. At the same time, the reward systems that should make social connection feel pleasurable become dampened, so that even positive social experiences fail to generate the satisfaction and motivation that would encourage further relationship building. It is as if loneliness creates a neurological trap, making people desperate for connection while simultaneously making connection feel dangerous and unrewarding. This helps explain why simply telling lonely people to join social groups or attend more events rarely solves the problem. By the time loneliness has become chronic, it has often altered perception and cognition in ways that make social situations feel threatening rather than welcoming. A lonely person walking into a party does not see opportunities for connection. They see potential sources of rejection and humiliation. They interpret the laughter of strangers as evidence that others are judging them, misread friendly overtures as pity or social obligation, and approach interactions with defensive strategies that actually make genuine connection less likely to occur. The cruel irony is that loneliness often makes people behave in ways that drive others away, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of social rejection. Chronic loneliness can make people more demanding in relationships, more sensitive to perceived slights, more likely to withdraw at the first sign of conflict, and more prone to negative interpretations of ambiguous social situations. It can also make people more boring to be around, as the energy required to maintain social facades leaves little capacity for the spontaneity, humour and genuine interest in others that makes someone attractive as a friend or romantic partner. The longer someone experiences loneliness, the more their social skills atrophy, creating an increasingly wide gap between their desire for connection and their ability to achieve it. Part 2. When the heart speaks the language of pain. There is something that happens in the human brain when we experience social rejection that reveals a profound truth about our nature as fundamentally social beings. Imagine for a moment that you are playing a simple computer game where 3 people toss a ball back and forth. At first the ball comes to you regularly. You throw it to one of the other players, they throw it back or to the third person, and the game continues in a pleasant rhythm of shared activity. But then something shifts. The ball stops coming to you. The other 2 players continue tossing it back and forth between themselves, completely ignoring your virtual presence, excluding you from their digital interaction. This simple scenario, called the cyberball experiment, has been used by neuroscientists to study what happens in the brain when we experience social exclusion. The results are remarkable and disturbing in equal measure. When people realize they are being excluded from the ball-tossing game, even though they know it is just a computer simulation, even though the other players are not real people but programmed algorithms, their brains activate the same neural pathways that process physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insular, regions that light up when you burn your hand on a hot stove or stub your toe on a table leg, show identical activation patterns when you experience social rejection. This is not metaphor or poetic language. When we say that rejection hurts, that loneliness aches, that social exclusion is painful, we are describing literal neurological reality. Evolution has wired our brains so that social pain and physical pain share the same biological pathways, the same neural circuits, the same neurochemical responses. The reason for this remarkable arrangement becomes clear when we consider that for most of human evolutionary history, social exclusion from the group meant death. Our ancestors who were cast out from their tribes faced starvation, predation, and exposure to elements that would kill them within days or weeks. Under these conditions, it made perfect evolutionary sense for the brain to treat social rejection as a physical emergency, triggering pain signals powerful enough to motivate whatever behavior might be necessary to restore social connection. But here is where the evolutionary logic that served our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years begins to work against us in the modern world. Our brains still respond to social exclusion as if it were a life-threatening emergency, even when the exclusion is temporary, minor, or occurs in contexts where our physical survival is not actually at stake. The teenager who does not get invited to a party experiences the same neural activation as someone facing physical assault. The adult who feels ignored at a work meeting triggers the same pain pathways as someone with a broken bone. The elderly person living alone activates emergency stress responses as if they were being attacked by predators day after day, week after week, until the chronic activation of these systems begins to damage their health in measurable ways. Dr. Naomi Eisenberger, a neuroscientist at UCLA, who has spent decades studying the neural basis of social pain, describes it this way. The social attachment system appears to have co-opted the pain system, borrowing the pain signal to prevent the detrimental consequences of social separation. This co-option explains why experiences of social rejection or loss have been described as some of the most painful experiences that we, as humans, face. It also explains why the same medications that reduce physical pain, like acetaminophen, can also reduce the emotional pain of social rejection and loneliness. But the relationship between social pain and physical pain goes even deeper than shared neural pathways. Chronic loneliness appears to dysregulate the body's stress response systems in ways that have cascading effects throughout the entire organism. When people experience ongoing social isolation, their bodies remain in a constant state of alert, as if preparing for threats that never fully materialize but never fully disappear. Stress hormones like cortisol remain elevated, inflammatory markers increase, immune function becomes compromised, sleep patterns become disrupted, and cardiovascular systems show signs of wear that typically appear only after years of physical illness or intense psychological trauma. The research reveals something even more disturbing about how loneliness affects the brain over time. Chronic social isolation appears to create what researchers call hypervigilance for social threats, a neurological state where the brain becomes exquisitely sensitive to any possible sign of rejection, criticism, or social danger. Lonely people develop what amounts to social paranoia, not because they are mentally ill, but because their brains have been rewired by chronic activation of threat detection systems. They begin to interpret neutral facial expressions as hostile, read rejection into ambiguous social situations, and approach interactions with defensive strategies that often create the very rejection they fear. Consider Maria, a 68-year-old widow who moved to a retirement community in Arizona after her husband died. For the first few months, she made genuine efforts to connect with her neighbors, attending community dinners, joining the book club, participating in exercise classes designed for seniors. But each social interaction felt forced and artificial to her. Conversations seemed to focus on topics she found boring or irrelevant, and she began to suspect that other residents were merely tolerating her presence out of politeness rather than genuine interest. These suspicions were likely unfounded, the normal social awkwardness that anyone might experience when adjusting to a new environment and dealing with grief. But Maria's brain, already stressed by bereavement and the major life transition of relocating, began to interpret these minor social difficulties as evidence of fundamental rejection. She started declining invitations, avoiding common areas where she might encounter neighbors, and spending increasing amounts of time alone in her apartment, watching television or reading novels that transported her to imaginary worlds where social connection felt safer and more predictable. The more isolated she became, the more her brain's threat detection systems ramped up their activity, making every potential social interaction feel more dangerous and less rewarding. Within 6 months, Maria had become almost completely socially withdrawn, convinced that she was fundamentally unlikable and that attempting to connect with others would only result in humiliation and rejection. This pattern of social withdrawal triggered by hypervigilance, is one of the most insidious aspects of chronic loneliness. The brain changes that result from prolonged isolation create a kind of neurological trap, where the very system designed to motivate social reconnection begins to make social connection feel impossible. Lonely people often report that they desperately want close relationships but feel simultaneously terrified of the vulnerability that intimacy requires. They may find themselves pushing others away just as relationships begin to deepen, sabotaging friendships or romantic connections through suspicious behavior, emotional withdrawal, or unrealistic demands for constant reassurance. The neurochemical changes associated with chronic loneliness also affect the brain's reward systems in ways that make positive social experiences less satisfying and motivating. The same mechanisms that should make friendship, love, and community membership feel pleasurable and reinforcing become dampened, so that even objectively positive social interactions fail to generate the psychological rewards that would encourage someone to seek out more connection. It is like developing tolerance to a drug, except that the drug in this case is human relationship itself. Lonely people may find themselves feeling empty and unsatisfied, even after spending time with others, wondering why activities that seem to bring joy to other people leave them feeling more isolated than before. This helps explain why loneliness tends to be self-perpetuating in ways that other negative emotional states are not. Someone who is temporarily sad or anxious can usually find relief through social support, connection with others who care about them, or engagement in meaningful activities that restore their sense of purpose and belonging. But someone who is chronically lonely may find that the very social support that should provide relief instead feels threatening, overwhelming, or hollow. They may interpret offers of help as evidence that others see them as pathetic or needy, view expressions of concern as intrusive or manipulative, and experience social gatherings as exhausting performances rather than sources of genuine nourishment. The immune system changes associated with chronic loneliness are particularly striking and reveal just how deeply social connection is wired into our biology. Researchers have found that lonely people show increased expression of genes that promote inflammation and decreased expression of genes that provide antiviral protection. This makes evolutionary sense if we consider that our ancestors who were socially isolated faced increased risk of physical injury from conflict or accident, situations where inflammatory responses would be helpful for healing wounds. But they faced decreased risk of viral infections, which typically spread through close social contact. The problem is that this ancient genetic program is still running in modern environments where social isolation does not actually increase physical danger, but does increase exposure to stress-related diseases that are exacerbated by chronic inflammation. The result is that lonely people are more susceptible to a wide range of health problems, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, and even certain types of cancer. They are also more likely to develop dementia and cognitive decline as they age, possibly because social interaction provides the kind of complex cognitive stimulation that helps maintain brain function over time. Loneliness literally ages the body and brain faster than normal, creating a downward spiral where social isolation leads to physical and cognitive decline, which in turn makes social connection more difficult to achieve and maintain. Perhaps most tragically, the neurological changes associated with chronic loneliness can alter personality in ways that make someone less attractive as a friend, romantic partner, or family member. Lonely people often become more self-focused, less empathetic, more critical of others, and less able to engage in the kind of reciprocal emotional support that healthy relationships require. This is not because they are selfish or fundamentally flawed as human beings, but because chronic activation of threat detection systems makes it difficult to attend to the needs and experiences of others when your own survival feels constantly at stake. The lonely brain becomes like a smoke detector that has become too sensitive, going off in response to minor social friction that would not register as threatening to someone with healthier social connections. Part 3. The prison of negative thoughts. There is a particular kind of mental torture that accompanies chronic loneliness, a relentless internal dialogue that plays like a broken record in the minds of people who have become trapped in cycles of social isolation. It begins subtly with small observations and interpretations that might seem reasonable to an outside observer. She did not respond to my text message right away. Maybe she's busy. He seemed distracted during our conversation. Perhaps he has a lot on his mind. They went to dinner without inviting me, but they probably assumed I would be too busy to join them. These initial thoughts feel like normal social analysis, the kind of mental processing that anyone might engage in while trying to understand the behavior of friends and acquaintances. But in the mind of someone experiencing chronic loneliness, these neutral observations quickly transform into something much darker and more destructive. She did not respond to my text because she finds me annoying and is hoping I will take the hint and stop contacting her. He seemed distracted because he was bored by what I was saying and was looking for an excuse to end the conversation. They went to dinner without me because they actively dislike spending time with me and only tolerate my presence when social obligation requires it. What began as reasonable attempts to understand social situations becomes a systematic pattern of negative interpretation that transforms every ambiguous social cue into evidence of rejection, dislike, or social inadequacy. Cognitive behavioral therapists call these automatic negative thoughts, and they represent one of the most powerful mechanisms by which loneliness perpetuates itself. The lonely mind becomes like a prosecuting attorney building a case against the self, collecting evidence of social failure while systematically ignoring or dismissing any information that might contradict the narrative of fundamental unlovability. A lonely person might receive 10 positive social interactions and 1 neutral or slightly negative interaction in a given day, but their attention will focus almost exclusively on that single ambiguous moment, analysing it for hidden meanings and using it as confirmation that their worst fears about themselves are true. The positive interactions get discounted as politeness, pity, or social obligation, while the negative interaction gets magnified into proof of their essential social incompetence. Dr. John Cacioppo, who spent decades studying the psychology of loneliness at the University of Chicago, identified this negative cognitive bias as perhaps the most important factor in understanding why some people recover from temporary social isolation while others become trapped in chronic loneliness. According to his research, lonely individuals typically do not voluntarily become lonely. Rather, they find themselves on one edge of the continuum of social connections and feeling desperately isolated. The perception that one is socially on the edge and isolated from others increases the motive for self-preservation. But paradoxically, this heightened self-focus makes genuine connection with others more difficult to achieve. When someone is constantly monitoring social situations for signs of threat or rejection, they have less mental energy available for the kind of generous attention to others that makes relationships feel rewarding and meaningful. Consider David, a 45-year-old software engineer who moved to Seattle for a new job after his divorce became final. He joined a hiking club. hoping to meet people who shared his love of outdoor activities and his desire for a more active social life in his new city. The first few group hikes went reasonably well. Conversations were friendly, if not particularly deep, and he felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of developing friendships with some of the regular participants. But then came a hike where he made what he later recognized as a minor social misstep, enthusiastically sharing a story about a previous hiking experience that went on longer than the natural rhythm of conversation warranted, causing a brief lull in the group discussion. To most people, this would have been a forgettable moment of social awkwardness, the kind of minor conversational fumble that happens to everyone and rarely affects how others perceive us. But David's mind, already primed by months of social isolation and the stress of major life changes, seized on this moment as evidence of his fundamental social inadequacy. He began to replay the interaction obsessively, analyzing every facial expression he could remember, convinced that he had revealed himself as boring, self-centered, and socially clueless. He started interpreting subsequent interactions with hiking group members through this lens, seeing polite greetings as barely disguised irritation, friendly invitations as social obligations that people felt trapped into extending. Over the following weeks, David's behavior in the hiking group became increasingly self-conscious and defensive. He spoke less during group conversations, worried that anything he said might be another social mistake. He began declining invitations to post-hike meals or social gatherings, convinced that his presence was merely tolerated rather than genuinely welcomed. When other group members noticed his withdrawal and made efforts to include him more actively, he interpreted their increased attention as confirmation that they had indeed been judging him negatively, and were now making awkward attempts to be kind to someone they saw as socially incompetent. This pattern of negative interpretation created a self-fulfilling prophecy that ultimately drove David away from the hiking group entirely. His defensive behavior and social withdrawal gradually made him less attractive as a potential friend, not because people disliked him, but because his guarded interactions made it difficult for others to get to know him or feel that he was genuinely interested in knowing them. The very strategies he employed to protect himself from rejection actually increased the likelihood that others would lose interest in developing deeper relationships with him. Within 6 months, David had convinced himself that joining the hiking group had been a mistake, and that he was simply not the kind of person who could develop meaningful friendships as an adult. This cycle of negative interpretation, defensive behavior, and social withdrawal represents what psychologists call a cognitive trap. A pattern of thinking that feels logical and protective, but actually perpetuates the very problems it is designed to solve. The lonely mind becomes hypervigilant for signs of social threat, but this hypervigilance creates a kind of tunnel vision that makes it difficult to accurately assess social situations or recognize genuine opportunities for connection. Someone trapped in this pattern might walk into a party and immediately notice the one person who seems uninterested in talking to them while completely missing 3 other people who would be delighted to have a conversation. They might interpret a friend's busy schedule as evidence of declining interest in the relationship, while failing to recognize that the friend has been dealing with work stress or family problems that have nothing to do with their feelings about the friendship. The cognitive patterns associated with chronic loneliness also tend to become more rigid and absolute over time, characterized by what therapists call all-or-nothing thinking. Instead of recognizing that social relationships exist on a continuum, with various levels of intimacy, commitment, and mutual interest, lonely people often divide their social world into stark categories of complete acceptance or total rejection. A friend who takes a few days to respond to a text message is not seen as busy or dealing with their own priorities, but as someone who has fundamentally changed their feelings about the relationship. A romantic interest who seems less enthusiastic on one date than they were on previous dates is not seen as having a bad day or processing their own concerns, but as someone who has discovered fatal flaws that make continued dating impossible. This tendency toward absolute thinking makes it difficult for lonely people to navigate the normal fluctuations and complexities that characterize all human relationships. They may expect constant reassurance from friends, interpreting any change in communication patterns or energy levels as signs of impending abandonment. They may struggle with the ambiguity that characterizes the early stages of romantic relationships, needing immediate certainty about the other person's feelings and intentions in ways that actually push potential partners away. They may have difficulty maintaining friendships through periods of reduced contact or changing life circumstances, assuming that physical distance or busy schedules necessarily mean emotional distance as well. The internal dialogue of someone trapped in these cognitive patterns becomes increasingly harsh and self-critical over time. They develop what psychologists call an internal critic, a voice in their head that provides running commentary on their social performance, usually focusing on perceived failures and inadequacies while minimizing or dismissing any evidence of social success. This internal critic might say things like, "You talked too much during that conversation. Everyone probably thinks you are desperate for attention." Or, "She only invited you to her party because she felt sorry for you, not because she actually enjoys your company." Or, "If you were really an interesting person, people would make more effort to spend time with you instead of always being too busy when you suggest getting together." Over time, this negative self-talk becomes so automatic and pervasive that lonely people may not even recognize it as a pattern of thinking that can be questioned or changed. The critical voice begins to feel like objective reality rather than a biased interpretation of social experiences. They may develop what psychologists call learned helplessness about their social lives, becoming convinced that their loneliness is a fixed characteristic rather than a temporary condition that can be improved through different ways of thinking and behaving. This sense of helplessness can become so profound that they stop making efforts to connect with others, not because they do not want relationships, but because they have become convinced that such efforts are doomed to failure and will only result in more pain and rejection. The most insidious aspect of these cognitive patterns is how they become self-reinforcing through a process that therapists call confirmation bias. Once someone becomes convinced that they are fundamentally unlikable or socially incompetent, their brain begins to filter information in ways that confirm this belief while ignoring or discounting evidence that contradicts it. They notice every social mistake they make while forgetting positive interactions. They remember critical comments from others while dismissing compliments as insincere. They focus on relationships that did not work out while failing to recognize the connections that have remained stable and supportive over time. This selective attention creates the illusion that their negative beliefs about themselves are based on objective evidence, when in reality they are based on a systematically biased interpretation of their social experiences. Breaking free from these cognitive traps requires more than simply trying to think more positively or practice better social skills. It requires developing what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about thinking, to recognize that thoughts are mental events rather than objective facts, and to question the accuracy of automatic interpretations that arise in social situations. This process can be challenging because the negative thought patterns associated with chronic loneliness often feel completely logical and justified to the person experiencing them. It takes considerable practice and often professional support to develop the ability to step back from these thoughts and ask questions like, is there another way to interpret this situation? What evidence supports or contradicts this interpretation? And how might someone else understand what just happened? Part 4. Sartre's condemned freedom and the anxiety of choice. There is a scene in Jean-Paul Sartre's novel The Age of Reason, where the protagonist Mathieu sits in a cafe watching the other patrons and suddenly becomes overwhelmed by the weight of his own freedom. He realizes that every person around him is making choices about how to live, what to value, how to relate to others, and that these choices are not predetermined by God, nature, or social convention, but emerge from the radical freedom that defines human existence. This freedom, which might seem like cause for celebration, instead fills Mathieu with profound anxiety because he understands that it makes him completely responsible for who he becomes and how his life unfolds. There is no external authority to blame for his failures, no predetermined essence to excuse his choices, no cosmic plan that relieves him of the burden of creating meaning through his own decisions and actions. This existential insight lies at the heart of Sartre's famous declaration that human beings are condemned to be free. We are condemned, he argues, because we did not choose to be born, did not select the historical moment or cultural context into which we were thrown, and cannot escape the responsibility of making choices about how to live, even when we would prefer to have our decisions made for us by others. Yet we are free because no external force can ultimately determine what we make of our circumstances, how we interpret our experiences, or what values we choose to embrace in response to the situations we encounter. This freedom is both the source of human dignity and the root of existential anxiety, because it means that we must create ourselves through our choices without any guarantee that we are choosing correctly or that our choices will lead to fulfillment rather than regret. For Sartre, loneliness often represents a failure to embrace this radical freedom authentically, a tendency to flee from the anxiety of choice into what he calls bad faith. Bad faith involves deceiving ourselves about the extent of our freedom, pretending that our choices are determined by external circumstances, social roles, or unchangeable aspects of our personality, rather than by our own ongoing decisions about how to engage with the world. Someone experiencing chronic loneliness might tell themselves that they are simply not the kind of person who is good at making friends, that their social isolation is caused by their personality type or their appearance or their social class, rather than by the specific choices they make about how to approach and interact with other people. This self-deception provides temporary relief from the anxiety of freedom, but it also traps them in patterns of behavior that perpetuate the very problems they claim to be unable to change. Consider Jennifer, a 38-year-old accountant who has been telling herself for years that she is just an introvert who naturally prefers solitude to social interaction. This self-concept allows her to avoid confronting the more uncomfortable truth that she is desperately lonely and terrified of the vulnerability that meaningful relationships require. Instead of acknowledging her desire for connection and taking responsibility for the choices that keep her isolated, she has constructed an identity around being someone who does not need other people, someone who is too sophisticated or self-sufficient to require the kind of emotional support that seems to be necessary for most people. This narrative protects her from having to face the anxiety of reaching out to others, risking rejection, or examining the ways that her own behaviour might contribute to her social isolation. But the cost of this bad faith is enormous. By refusing to acknowledge her freedom to choose different ways of relating to others, Jennifer remains trapped in patterns of social avoidance that make genuine connection impossible. She declines invitations by telling herself that she would not enjoy social gatherings anyway, avoids deeper conversations by convincing herself that she is protecting her privacy, and dismisses potential romantic relationships by deciding in advance that she is too independent to make the compromises that partnership requires. Each of these choices feels inevitable and necessary to her, but they are actually expressions of her freedom that she has chosen not to recognize as choices. Sartre would argue that Jennifer's loneliness is not caused by her personality or her circumstances, but by her refusal to take authentic responsibility for creating the kind of relationships she actually wants. She has fallen into what he calls the spirit of seriousness, treating her self-concept as an objective fact rather than a story she tells herself about who she is, a story that she has the power to rewrite through different choices and actions. The existentialist approach to healing loneliness would involve helping Jennifer recognize that her identity as someone who prefers solitude is not a natural given, but a choice she makes every day, and that she could choose differently if she were willing to accept the anxiety and uncertainty that comes with authentic engagement with others. This recognition would be simultaneously liberating and terrifying, because it would force her to confront her own responsibility for her social isolation, while also opening up possibilities for connection that currently seem impossible. The existentialist understanding of loneliness also reveals how modern society creates conditions that make authentic relationship particularly difficult to achieve. Sartre argued that capitalist economic systems encourage people to relate to each other primarily as objects to be used for personal advancement, rather than as free subjects worthy of genuine encounter. In a culture that prioritizes individual success, material accumulation and competitive achievement, relationships often become instrumental rather than intrinsic, valued for what they can do for us rather than for the opportunity they provide to encounter another consciousness in all its freedom and complexity. This instrumentalization of human relationship creates what Sartre calls alienation, a condition where people feel disconnected not only from others, but from their own authentic desires and values. Think about how this plays out in contemporary professional networking, dating apps, or social media interactions. People present carefully curated versions of themselves designed to achieve specific goals, whether those goals involve career advancement, romantic success, or social status. The focus is on managing impressions and optimizing outcomes, rather than on genuine encounter between free subjects who are willing to reveal themselves authentically and encounter others with openness and curiosity. This approach to relationship may be effective for achieving certain practical objectives, but it cannot provide the kind of deep human connection that addresses existential loneliness, because it treats others as means to our ends rather than as ends in themselves. Sartre's analysis helps explain why many people in contemporary society feel lonely even when they are surrounded by others and actively engaged in social activities. If most of our interactions are characterized by performance, strategic self-presentation, and instrumental goals, then we may have many social connections without ever experiencing genuine encounter with another human being. We may be successful at networking, dating, and social media engagement, while remaining fundamentally isolated from the kind of authentic human contact that addresses our deepest needs for recognition, understanding, and mutual acknowledgement of our shared humanity. The problem is not that we lack social skills or opportunities for interaction, but that we have learned to approach relationships in ways that make authentic encounter nearly impossible. The existentialist approach to overcoming loneliness involves what Sartre calls conversion, or radical change, in how we understand and exercise our freedom. This conversion requires recognizing that authenticity in relationships is not something we can achieve through technique or strategy, but only through the willingness to encounter others in their freedom while accepting responsibility for our own choices about how to engage with them. It means giving up the security of predetermined roles and social scripts in favor of the anxiety-provoking but ultimately more rewarding experience of meeting others as unique individuals whose responses cannot be predicted or controlled. It means accepting that every interaction involves risk, that authentic relationship requires vulnerability, and that we cannot guarantee positive outcomes even when we approach others with complete sincerity and openness. This existentialist vision of authentic relationships stands in sharp contrast to much of the advice offered by self-help books and social skills training programs. Instead of focusing on techniques for making good impressions or strategies for becoming more attractive to others, the existentialist approach emphasizes the importance of becoming more honest about our own desires, fears, and motivations, while developing the courage to encounter others without predetermined agendas or defensive strategies. It suggests that loneliness often persists not because we lack social skills, but because we are unwilling to accept the fundamental uncertainty and vulnerability that characterize all authentic human relationships. We want the benefits of deep connection without the risks of genuine encounter, the satisfaction of being known without the danger of being rejected, the comfort of relationship without the anxiety of freedom. But perhaps most importantly, Sartre's existentialist philosophy suggests that overcoming loneliness requires recognizing our fundamental interdependence with others, not as a limitation on our freedom, but as the very condition that makes freedom meaningful. We become who we are through our relationships with others, and our choices about how to relate inevitably affect not only our own lives, but the lives of everyone we encounter. This means that the decision to approach relationships authentically rather than strategically is not just a personal choice, but an ethical commitment that acknowledges the freedom and dignity of others while taking responsibility for our own contribution to the human community. When we choose authentic encounter over instrumental interaction, we create conditions that make it easier for others to respond authentically as well, contributing to a social environment where genuine connection becomes more possible for everyone. Part 5. Levinas and the infinite responsibility to the other. There is a moment that Emmanuel Levinas describes in his philosophical writings that captures something essential about the nature of authentic human encounter. A moment that he believes occurs before language, before thought, even before self-consciousness as we normally understand it. You are walking down a street absorbed in your own concerns when you suddenly encounter the face of another person. Not their facial features or physical appearance, but what Levinas calls the face, in a deeper sense, the irreducible otherness of another human being that addresses you directly and immediately, making a claim on your attention and responsibility that cannot be ignored or explained away. In this encounter, according to Levinas, you experience something that disrupts your normal self-centered existence and awakens you to an ethical responsibility that exists prior to any conscious decision about how to treat other people. This may sound abstract or mystical, but Levinas is describing something that most people have experienced at some point in their lives, though they may not have recognized it as philosophically significant. Think of a time when you encountered someone in distress, a homeless person on the street, a child who was lost and frightened, an elderly person who had fallen and needed help. In such moments you may have felt an immediate sense of responsibility that arose before you had time to think about it. A spontaneous recognition that this other person's vulnerability created an obligation for you to respond, even if responding was inconvenient or uncomfortable. This immediate ethical response, according to Levinas, reveals something fundamental about human nature that is usually obscured by our preoccupation with our own needs, goals, and concerns. For Levinas, loneliness represents a kind of ethical failure, not in the sense of moral wrongdoing, but in the sense of a failure to remain open to the call of the other that could rescue us from the prison of self-absorption. When we become chronically lonely, we often turn inward, becoming increasingly focused on our own pain, our own needs, our own desire for connection and recognition. This inward turn feels natural and necessary, but it actually makes authentic relationship more difficult to achieve because it makes it harder for us to attend to the reality and needs of other people. We become so preoccupied with whether others like us, whether we are making good impressions, whether our own emotional needs are being met, that we lose the capacity for what Levinas calls attention to the other, the generous and selfless focus on another person's experience that makes genuine encounter possible. Consider Michael, a 52-year-old man who became socially isolated after losing his job during a corporate restructuring that eliminated his entire department. The unemployment was devastating not only financially but psychologically, undermining his sense of identity and social worth in ways that made it difficult for him to maintain his existing friendships and impossible to form new ones. When friends invited him to social gatherings, he found himself constantly worried about how others perceived his unemployment, whether they saw him as a failure, whether they were comparing his situation to their own professional success. These self-focused concerns made it difficult for him to engage genuinely with others, to ask about their lives, to offer support when they faced their own challenges, or to contribute to conversations in ways that felt natural and spontaneous. From a Levinasian perspective, Michael's loneliness was perpetuated not by his unemployment itself, but by his inability to move beyond preoccupation with his own social status and emotional needs. His interactions with others became opportunities to seek reassurance, validation, or distraction from his own problems, rather than genuine encounters where he could attend to the experiences and needs of other people. This focus on himself, while understandable given his circumstances, actually made him less attractive as a friend and companion because it reduced his capacity for the kind of reciprocal interest and emotional generosity that sustains meaningful relationships. People began to avoid him not because they judged his professional situation, but because interactions with him became one-sided and emotionally draining, focused on his needs rather than on mutual exchange and shared attention to common concerns. The Levinasian approach to healing loneliness would involve helping Michael rediscover his capacity for what might be called ethical attention, the ability to focus on others in ways that acknowledge their irreducible otherness and infinite worth. This does not mean ignoring his own needs or pretending that his problems do not matter, but rather recognizing that attending to others can actually be a path toward healing his own sense of isolation and meaninglessness. When we encounter others with genuine attention and care, we discover that we are capable of transcending our own self-absorption in ways that restore our sense of connection to the human community. We also discover that focusing on the needs and experiences of others can provide relief from the endless rumination about our own problems that often characterizes chronic loneliness. This ethical dimension of relationship helps explain why volunteering, community service, and caregiving activities are often effective treatments for loneliness, even though they do not directly address someone's desire for social connection and personal recognition. When we focus on helping others, we experience what Levinas calls substitution, a temporary dissolution of the boundary between self and other that provides profound relief from the burden of self-consciousness. We also discover that we are needed and valuable in ways that do not depend on our social status, physical attractiveness, or entertaining personality, but simply on our willingness to respond to the vulnerability and needs of other human beings. This recognition can restore our sense of purpose and belonging even when our personal relationships remain limited or unsatisfying. But Levinas's philosophy goes even deeper than suggesting that helping others can make us feel less lonely. He argues that the very structure of human consciousness is fundamentally intersubjective, that we become who we are through our encounters with others, and that our sense of self emerges from our responses to the ethical demands that others place on us simply by existing. This means that loneliness is not just the absence of social connection, but a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature itself. A failure to recognize that we exist primarily in relationship rather than as isolated individuals who choose to relate to others. From this perspective, the cure for loneliness involves not finding others who will meet our needs, but rediscovering our own capacity to respond to the needs of others in ways that reveal our fundamental interconnectedness. This understanding of human nature challenges many of the assumptions that underlie contemporary approaches to relationships and social connection. Instead of focusing on self-improvement, social skills, or strategies for making ourselves more attractive to others, the Levinasian approach emphasizes the importance of developing our capacity for ethical response, our ability to encounter others in their irreducible otherness rather than as mirrors of our own needs and desires. It suggests that authentic relationship begins not with asking what others can do for us, but with recognizing what we are called to do for others, not with seeking recognition and validation, but with offering recognition and validation to those whose lives we encounter. This shift in focus from taking to giving, from being seen to seeing, from being understood to understanding, can transform the entire quality of our social interactions in ways that make genuine connection more likely to occur. The face-to-face encounter that Levinas describes as the foundation of ethical relationship also reveals why modern forms of communication and social interaction often fail to address the deepest dimensions of loneliness. Digital communication, social media interaction, and even many forms of in-person socializing can remain at the level of what Levinas calls totality, treating others as objects to be known, understood, or used rather than as infinite subjects who exceed our capacity to comprehend or control them. When we approach others with predetermined categories, expectations, or agendas, we miss the opportunity for genuine encounter with their otherness, the mysterious and irreducible aspects of their humanity that cannot be reduced to our concepts or purposes. This is why someone can have hundreds of social media connections or attend numerous social events while still feeling fundamentally alone. They are interacting with representations and projections rather than encountering the living reality of other human beings. The infinite responsibility that Levinas describes may sound overwhelming or even impossible to fulfill. But he argues that recognizing this impossibility is precisely what opens us to authentic relationship. When we understand that we cannot fully comprehend or satisfy the needs of another person, we approach them with the kind of humility and openness that makes genuine encounter possible. We give up the illusion that we can control relationships or guarantee positive outcomes, and instead commit ourselves to responding as fully as possible to what the other person reveals of themselves in each moment of interaction. This approach to relationship is inherently risky and uncertain, but it is also the only way to experience the kind of deep connection that can heal the existential loneliness that arises from feeling fundamentally separate from others. Part 6. Buber's Revolutionary Vision of I and Thou. Martin Buber tells a story about a moment in his childhood that would eventually reshape his entire understanding of human relationship and provide a framework for thinking about authentic connection that remains revolutionary nearly a century after he first articulated it. As a young boy living with his grandparents, Buber became fascinated with a horse that lived in their stable, spending hours brushing its coat and feeling what he later described as a profound sense of mutual recognition and connection with this animal. One day, while stroking the horse's neck, he suddenly became self-conscious about what he was doing, began to think about the experience rather than simply living it, and immediately felt the connection disappear. The horse seemed to sense this shift as well, becoming restless and distant, in a way that made it clear that something precious had been lost through the intrusion of analytical thinking into what had been a moment of pure encounter. This childhood experience became the foundation for Buber's revolutionary distinction between two fundamental ways that human beings can relate to the world around them, what he called I-it and I-thou relationships. The I-it relationship represents our normal mode of interaction with objects, people, and experiences that we encounter primarily as things to be analyzed, understood, used, or manipulated for our own purposes. When we relate to someone in I-it mode, we focus on their characteristics, their usefulness to us, their role in our lives, or their function in achieving our goals. We might think about what we can learn from them, how they can help us, whether they find us attractive or interesting, or how we can influence them to behave in ways that meet our needs. This way of relating is not necessarily bad or wrong. It is essential for navigating practical life, but it cannot provide the kind of deep connection that addresses our fundamental loneliness as human beings. The I-thou relationship, by contrast, represents a completely different quality of encounter, where we meet another being not as an object to be understood or used, but as a subject whose reality is as complete and mysterious as our own. In I-thou encounters, we temporarily set aside our analytical thinking, our personal agendas, and our self-conscious monitoring of the interaction, allowing ourselves to be fully present to the other in ways that create genuine meeting between two centers of consciousness. Buber insisted that the primary word I-thou can only be spoken with the whole being, while the primary word it can never be spoken with the whole being. This means that authentic encounter requires a kind of total presence and openness that is impossible when we are simultaneously trying to analyze, judge, or manipulate the interaction for our own purposes. Consider the difference between these two modes of relationship in the context of a conversation with a friend who is going through a difficult divorce. In I-it mode, you might find yourself thinking about how their situation compares to other divorces you have witnessed, what advice you should offer based on your knowledge of psychology or law, how their emotional state affects your own comfort level, or whether their problems are taking up too much space in the friendship. These thoughts are not necessarily selfish or inappropriate, but they create a kind of distance between you and your friend that makes genuine empathy and support more difficult to provide. You are relating to them as a problem to be solved, a situation to be analysed, or a role to be played, rather than as a whole person whose experience deserves your complete attention and presence. In I-thou mode, by contrast, you would set aside these analytical thoughts and allow yourself to be fully present to your friend's actual experience in the moment. You would listen not just to their words, but to the quality of their emotions, the rhythm of their speech, the things they are not saying as well as the things they are. You would respond not from your knowledge of what people in their situation usually need, but from your intuitive sense of what this particular person needs from you right now. You would allow their pain to touch you directly without immediately trying to fix it or make it more manageable. And you would trust that your genuine presence and attention might be more healing than any advice or solution you could offer. This distinction helps explain why many people feel lonely even when they are surrounded by others who care about them and want to help. If most of our interactions, even with close friends and family members, remain at the I-it level, we may receive practical support, useful advice, and social stimulation without ever experiencing the kind of deep recognition and acceptance that addresses our existential need to be seen and known for who we really are. We may be cared for without being truly met, understood intellectually without being encountered personally, appreciated for our roles and functions without being recognized in our essential humanity. This explains why someone can feel grateful for the support they receive from others while simultaneously feeling profoundly alone. They are being helped but not encountered, assisted but not truly seen. The I-thou relationship also cannot be sustained permanently or achieved through technique or effort. Buber emphasized that these moments of genuine encounter arise spontaneously and last only briefly before returning to the I-it world of practical interaction and analytical thinking. We cannot make I-thou relationships happen through willpower or social skills, but we can make ourselves more available for them by cultivating the kind of presence, openness and attention that creates conditions where genuine meeting becomes possible. This means learning to set aside our agendas and expectations, our need to manage impressions or control outcomes, our habitual ways of categorizing and judging others in favor of a more receptive and responsive way of being with people. For someone struggling with chronic loneliness, this distinction between I-it and I-thou relationships can be transformative because it shifts the focus from trying to get others to like or accept us to learning how to encounter others more fully and authentically. Instead of approaching social interactions with questions like, how can I make a good impression? Or what do they think of me? Or how can I get them to want to spend more time with me? We can approach interactions with questions like, how can I be most fully present to this person? Or what are they really trying to communicate? Or how can I respond to who they actually are rather than who I expect them to be? This shift in focus often has the paradoxical effect of making us more attractive to others, because genuine presence and attention are rare and precious gifts that people recognize and appreciate even when they cannot articulate exactly what makes an interaction feel different and more satisfying. The I-thou relationship also requires what Buber calls confirmation, the willingness to affirm the reality and worth of another person, even when we do not agree with their choices or understand their perspectives. Confirmation goes beyond tolerance or acceptance to represent a positive recognition of the other person's right to exist and develop according to their own inner nature rather than our expectations or desires for them. This kind of confirmation is particularly powerful in healing loneliness because it addresses the deep fear that many lonely people carry that they are fundamentally flawed or unworthy of genuine acceptance. When someone encounters us in I-thou mode and offers genuine confirmation of our reality and worth, we experience a kind of healing that cannot be achieved through reassurance, advice, or practical support alone. But perhaps most importantly, Buber's vision of I-thou relationship reveals that authentic human connection is not something we can achieve through individual effort or self-improvement, but only through mutual encounter where both people are willing to risk genuine meeting. This means that healing loneliness requires not just learning how to relate to others differently, but also developing the courage to reveal ourselves authentically and allow others to encounter us in our full reality rather than the carefully managed persona we typically present to the world. The I-thou relationship is inherently reciprocal. It cannot exist when only one person is willing to be present and open while the other remains defended and strategic. This reciprocity means that as we learn to encounter others more authentically, we also create conditions that invite them to encounter us more authentically, leading to the kind of mutual recognition and deep connection that can heal even the most profound loneliness. Part 7. Heidegger's Being With, the Fundamental Sociality of Human Existence. There is a profound insight at the heart of Martin Heidegger's philosophy that challenges everything we typically assume about human nature and the problem of loneliness. Most of us think of ourselves as individuals who exist first and then choose to relate to others, isolated subjects who reach out across the gap of separateness to form connections with other isolated subjects. But Heidegger argues that this entire way of thinking about human existence is backwards, that we never actually exist as isolated individuals at all, but always and already exist in relationship with others in ways that are so fundamental to our being that we cannot even conceive of ourselves apart from these relationships. What he calls being with, or Mitsein in German, is not something we choose, or something that happens to us secondarily, but the very structure of human existence itself. To understand what Heidegger means by this, consider the language you are using to think these thoughts right now. Every word you know, every concept you employ to make sense of your experience, every category you use to organize your understanding of yourself and the world around you. All of these came to you through relationships with other people. The language you think in was not invented by you, but inherited from countless generations of human beings who developed and refined these ways of making meaning together. Even your most private and individual thoughts are structured by linguistic and conceptual frameworks that you share with others, that connect you to communities of meaning that extend far beyond your immediate personal relationships. In this sense, you are never truly alone, even when you are physically isolated, because your very capacity for thought and self-understanding emerges from and remains embedded within networks of relationship that shape who you are at the most fundamental level. This insight has profound implications for understanding loneliness and what it might mean to heal it authentically. If being with is indeed fundamental to human existence, then chronic loneliness might be understood not as the absence of social connections, but as a kind of forgetting or denial of our essential relatedness to others. When we feel profoundly alone, we may be experiencing a disconnection not just from particular people in our immediate environment, but from our own recognition of how thoroughly our existence is intertwined with the existence of others, past and present, known and unknown. This suggests that healing loneliness might require not just forming new relationships, but remembering and reconnecting with the deeper truth of our fundamental interdependence with all human beings. Consider Sarah, a graduate student in philosophy who moved to a new city to attend university and found herself struggling with intense loneliness despite being surrounded by classmates and colleagues who shared her intellectual interests. She attended seminars, participated in study groups, went to department social events, and made what seemed like genuine efforts to connect with her peers, but somehow still felt fundamentally isolated and misunderstood. From a Heideggerian perspective, Sarah's loneliness might stem not from a lack of social opportunities or personal social skills, but from a kind of alienation from her own being with, a failure to recognize and embrace the ways that her intellectual work and personal development were already deeply connected to the community of scholars, past and present, who had created the tradition of thought she was entering. She was approaching relationships as if they were optional additions to an essentially solitary existence, rather than recognizing that her very capacity to think philosophically emerged from and remained embedded within a vast network of intellectual relationships that extended far beyond her immediate social circle. When Sarah began to understand her academic work not as individual achievement, but as participation in ongoing conversations that connected her to thinkers across centuries and continents, her experience of loneliness began to shift in subtle but important ways. She started to feel less isolated when working alone in the library because she recognized that her reading and writing were forms of relationship with the authors she was studying and the future readers who might encounter her ideas. She approached conversations with classmates not as opportunities to make personal connections or impress others with her knowledge, but as chances to participate in the collaborative work of thinking together about questions that mattered to the entire intellectual community they were joining. This shift in perspective did not immediately solve her social isolation, but it provided a foundation of belonging and purpose that made her less desperate for personal validation and more capable of genuine encounter with others. Heidegger's analysis of being with also reveals how modern individualistic culture systematically obscures our fundamental relatedness to others in ways that make loneliness more likely and more difficult to heal. When society teaches us to think of ourselves as autonomous individuals who are responsible for creating our own meaning, achieving our own success, and managing our own emotional needs, we lose touch with the deeper truth that all human meaning, success, and emotional well-being emerge from and depend upon our participation in shared worlds of significance. This individualistic ideology can make us feel ashamed of our need for others, as if dependency were a sign of weakness rather than a fundamental aspect of human nature, and it can make us approach relationships instrumentally as means to personal fulfillment rather than as opportunities to participate in the ongoing creation of shared meaning. The result is that we may seek connection while simultaneously resisting the kind of genuine interdependence that makes deep relationship possible. The concept of being with also helps explain why some of the most effective treatments for loneliness involve not just individual therapy or social skills training, but participation in meaningful shared activities that connect people to purposes and values larger than their individual concerns. When someone joins a volunteer organization, participates in political activism, engages in religious or spiritual community, or commits themselves to creative or intellectual projects that serve broader social purposes, they often experience relief from loneliness even when these activities do not directly address their personal social needs. This is because such activities reconnect them with their fundamental being with their essential participation in human communities that extend beyond their immediate personal relationships. They discover that they are needed and valuable not just as individuals seeking personal fulfillment, but as participants in ongoing collective projects that give meaning and purpose to human existence itself. But Heidegger also warns against what he calls inauthentic forms of being with, ways of relating to others that actually obscure rather than reveal our essential relatedness. When we fall into what he calls the they-self, losing ourselves in conformity to social expectations, public opinion, or cultural norms, we may appear to be well connected socially, while actually experiencing a profound alienation from our own authentic existence and our genuine relationships with others. Someone who is constantly seeking approval, following trends, or trying to fit in may have many social contacts without ever experiencing the kind of authentic being with that addresses existential loneliness. They may be socially successful while remaining fundamentally alone because they have lost touch with their own authentic way of being in the world and their capacity for genuine encounter with others who are also struggling to live authentically. The path toward authentic being with, according to Heidegger, requires what he calls resoluteness. The courage to embrace our own finite existence and take responsibility for our choices while simultaneously recognizing our fundamental interdependence with others. This means learning to distinguish between social conformity, which actually increases our isolation by disconnecting us from our authentic selves, and genuine community, which emerges when people come together in recognition of their shared human condition and mutual responsibility for creating meaningful existence together. Authentic being with is not about fitting in or being accepted, but about participating honestly and courageously in the ongoing human project of creating meaning in a world that does not provide predetermined significance or purpose. This kind of authentic relationship with others can only emerge when we have first developed an authentic relationship with our own existence, accepting both our freedom and our finitude, our possibilities and our limitations, our individuality, and our fundamental relatedness to others. This Heideggerian understanding of loneliness suggests that healing requires not just connecting with particular people, but reconnecting with the deeper truth of human existence as essentially and unavoidably relational. It means recognizing that our thoughts, values, language, and possibilities for meaning all emerge from and remain embedded within communities of relationship that extend far beyond our immediate social circle. It means approaching our own existence and the existence of others with what Heidegger calls care, a fundamental attentiveness to the preciousness and fragility of being that recognizes how thoroughly our individual flourishing depends upon the flourishing of the human communities we participate in. When we remember and embrace our essential being with, loneliness may not disappear entirely, but it loses its existential terror because we recognize that we are never truly alone, even in our solitude, always already connected to the vast network of relationships that make human existence possible and meaningful. Part 8. Arendt's Vision, the Human Condition of Plurality. Hannah Arendt lived through some of the darkest moments in human history, witnessing firsthand how political systems could systematically destroy not just individual lives, but the very conditions that make human flourishing possible. As a Jewish intellectual who fled Nazi Germany and lived as a stateless person for decades before finding refuge in America, she understood in the most visceral way how the breakdown of political community could leave individuals isolated, vulnerable, and stripped of their basic human dignity. This experience led her to develop one of the most profound insights about human nature and the conditions necessary for authentic relationship that has ever been articulated by a political philosopher. Human beings, she argued, exist in a condition of plurality, meaning that while we are all the same in being human, we are each utterly unique in ways that make our individual perspectives and contributions irreplaceable and essential to the human community. The concept of plurality, as Arendt understood it, goes far deeper than simple diversity or multiculturalism. She argued that plurality is the basic condition of both action and speech, the fundamental reality that makes it both possible and necessary for human beings to come together in political communities where they can reveal who they are through words and deeds. If human beings were all identical, she pointed out, we would not need language or politics because there would be nothing to discuss, negotiate, or decide together. If we were completely different from one another, communication and cooperation would be impossible because we would have no shared basis for understanding each other or working toward common goals. But because we exist in the condition of plurality, being both the same and different simultaneously, we both can and must come together to create the shared world that makes human life meaningful and dignified. This understanding of plurality has profound implications for thinking about loneliness and what it might mean to heal it authentically. From an Arendtian perspective, loneliness is not simply the absence of social connections or the lack of people who care about us, but the absence of opportunities to reveal who we are through action and speech, in the presence of others who can witness, remember, and respond to our unique contributions to the human community. We feel lonely when we have no arena in which to display our distinctive qualities, no audience for our particular insights and abilities, no community that needs what we specifically have to offer. This explains why someone can feel profoundly lonely even when surrounded by people who love and support them, if those relationships do not provide opportunities for them to act and speak in ways that reveal and develop their unique identity and capabilities. Consider Roberto, a retired engineer in his 70s who moved to a senior living community after his wife died and his adult children became concerned about his isolation and depression. The facility offered numerous social activities, group meals, organised entertainment, and opportunities for residents to interact with each other throughout the day. Roberto participated dutifully in these activities and developed friendly relationships with other residents, but he continued to feel a profound sense of meaninglessness and disconnection that no amount of social contact seemed to address. From an Arendtian perspective, Roberto's loneliness persisted because the senior living community, despite its good intentions, was organised primarily around care and entertainment, rather than around creating opportunities for residents to act meaningfully in the world and reveal their unique qualities and capabilities to others. The activities available to Roberto were designed to keep residents busy and socially engaged, but they did not provide what Arendt calls a space of appearance, an arena where people can come together as equals to address shared concerns and demonstrate their distinctive contributions to the common good. Roberto had spent his career designing bridges and buildings that served his community for decades, solving complex technical problems, mentoring younger engineers, and contributing his expertise to projects that made a tangible difference in the world. In the senior living community, by contrast, he was treated primarily as someone to be cared for rather than someone whose knowledge, experience and capabilities could serve others and contribute to shared purposes. His unique identity as an engineer, a problem solver and a mentor was irrelevant to his daily existence, leaving him feeling not just socially isolated but existentially diminished. When Roberto began volunteering with a local organization that built affordable housing, helping to review construction plans and mentor young people interested in engineering careers, his experience of loneliness began to shift dramatically. For the first time since retiring, he had opportunities to act in the world in ways that drew upon his distinctive knowledge and experience, to speak about subjects where his perspective was valuable and unique, and to participate in meaningful work that served purposes larger than his own personal needs. The volunteer work reconnected him not just with other people, but with his own sense of agency and significance, his capacity to make a difference in the world through his particular combination of skills, knowledge and experience. He was no longer just Roberto the widower or Roberto the senior citizen, but Roberto the engineer whose expertise could help solve problems and whose mentorship could shape the next generation of professionals in his field. This example illustrates Arendt's insight that human beings need more than care, entertainment, or even affection to feel fully alive and connected. We need opportunities to act in the world, to take initiatives that reveal our distinctive qualities and capabilities, to participate in shared projects that allow us to demonstrate who we are, rather than simply what we need. Action, in Arendt's technical sense, is different from both labour, which maintains biological life, and work, which creates durable objects for human use. Action involves taking initiatives in the human world, beginning something new, revealing through words and deeds the unique identity that distinguishes each person from all others who have ever lived or will ever live. The space of appearance that makes action possible cannot be created through individual effort, but only emerges when people come together specifically for the purpose of acting and speaking about matters of common concern. This is why Arendt was so concerned about what she saw as the rise of mass society, forms of social organization that eliminate spaces where individuals can come together as equals to address shared problems and reveal their distinctive contributions to the human community. When social life becomes organized primarily around consumption, entertainment, or the management of private needs, people lose opportunities for the kind of public action that allows them to develop and display their unique identities. They may be well cared for and socially connected, but they remain fundamentally lonely because they have no arena in which to act as the distinctive individuals they are capable of becoming. Modern consumer culture systematically undermines the conditions necessary for the kind of action that Arendt believed was essential to human flourishing. When social life revolves around shopping, entertainment, social media performance, or the pursuit of private satisfactions, people may be constantly interacting with others without ever having opportunities to act together on matters of genuine common concern. They may be busy and socially engaged while remaining politically powerless and existentially invisible, known for their consumer preferences or lifestyle choices, but not for their unique capabilities and contributions to shared projects. This produces a particular kind of modern loneliness that cannot be addressed simply by increasing social contact or improving individual relationship skills, but requires creating new spaces of appearance where people can come together to act on matters that transcend their private interests and concerns. The healing of loneliness from an Arendtian perspective requires not just finding people who will accept and care for us, but finding or creating communities where we can act meaningfully alongside others who share our concerns about common problems and possibilities. This might involve political activism, community organizing, collaborative creative projects, volunteer service, professional associations, religious communities, or any other form of organization that brings people together to address shared challenges and opportunities rather than simply to socialize or meet individual needs. What matters is not the specific content of the activity, but the opportunity it provides for people to take initiatives, demonstrate their distinctive capabilities, and participate in projects that create lasting additions to the human world. When we find such opportunities, we often discover that our loneliness was not primarily about lacking social connections, but about lacking occasions to reveal and develop who we are capable of becoming when we act alongside others in pursuit of purposes larger than our individual concerns. Part 9. Breaking the Chains, Interventions that Actually Work. There is a moment in cognitive behavioral therapy for loneliness when something shifts in the room, when a person who has been trapped in cycles of negative thinking and social withdrawal suddenly realizes that their thoughts about themselves and others are not objective facts, but interpretations that can be questioned and changed. Dr. Megan Gerber, a therapist in Chicago who specializes in treating chronic loneliness, describes it as watching someone wake up from a dream they did not realize they were having. The client might say something like, "Wait, you mean when Sarah took 3 days to respond to my text? That doesn't necessarily mean she's decided she doesn't want to be friends with me anymore." It sounds almost absurdly simple when stated so directly. But for someone whose brain has been rewired by chronic loneliness to interpret every ambiguous social situation as evidence of rejection, this recognition can be genuinely revolutionary. The research on treating loneliness reveals something both hopeful and sobering about the nature of this epidemic. Psychological interventions can significantly reduce loneliness compared to control groups, yielding effect sizes that are meaningful and clinically significant. But the most effective approaches are not what most people would intuitively expect. Simply increasing social contact, improving social skills, or providing more opportunities for social interaction, while helpful, are not sufficient to address the deeper cognitive and emotional patterns that maintain chronic loneliness. The interventions that work best are those that directly target what researchers call maladaptive social cognitions, the systematic patterns of negative thinking about self and others that make genuine connection feel impossible even when opportunities for relationship are abundant. Consider the case of Janet, a 43-year-old librarian who came to therapy after recognizing that her loneliness had become so severe that she was avoiding not just social events, but also routine interactions like grocery shopping or going to the bank because she felt too anxious and self-conscious to handle even brief exchanges with cashiers or service workers. Her therapist began not by encouraging her to socialize more, but by helping her identify the automatic thoughts that arose whenever she anticipated or experienced social interaction. Janet discovered that she was constantly running a kind of internal commentary that interpreted neutral social situations as threatening or rejecting. When a colleague said good morning without making eye contact, Janet's immediate thought was, "She thinks I'm weird and is trying to avoid having to talk to me." When a neighbour waved briefly while walking their dog, her automatic interpretation was, "He's just being polite because he has to live next to me, but he obviously doesn't want to have an actual conversation." The therapeutic work involved teaching Janet to recognize these automatic thoughts as mental events rather than factual observations, and then to systematically examine the evidence for and against these interpretations. Her therapist introduced her to the concept of thought records, written exercises where she would document the specific thoughts that arose in social situations and then analyze them using questions like, what evidence supports this interpretation? And what are alternative ways of understanding this situation? And how would I interpret this same behavior if I observed it happening between two other people? This process revealed how systematically biased her social perceptions had become, how consistently she interpreted ambiguous social cues in the most negative possible way, while ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicted her assumptions about others' attitudes toward her. The work was slow and sometimes frustrating, because the negative thought patterns had become so automatic that Janet often did not recognize them as thoughts at all, experiencing them instead as direct perceptions of social reality. But as Janet developed skill in identifying and questioning her automatic negative thoughts, something remarkable began to happen in her actual social interactions. When she stopped assuming that others were judging her negatively, she became less defensive and self-conscious in conversations, which made her more attractive as a conversation partner and friend. When she stopped interpreting neutral social cues as evidence of rejection, she became more willing to take social risks like initiating conversations, suggesting activities, or expressing genuine interest in other people's lives. Most importantly, when she stopped filtering her social experiences through the lens of anticipated rejection, she began to notice positive social cues that had always been present but had been invisible to her anxious and hypervigilant mind. The cognitive approach to treating loneliness is particularly effective because it addresses what researchers recognize as the core maintaining factor in chronic social isolation. Loneliness creates what amounts to a cognitive trap, where the brain changes that result from chronic social isolation make social situations feel more threatening and less rewarding, which leads to avoidance and withdrawal, which increases isolation, which reinforces the negative thought patterns that made social connection feel impossible in the first place. Breaking this cycle requires more than simply encouraging lonely people to socialize more, because their altered cognition makes social situations genuinely aversive and unrewarding. Instead, it requires systematically retraining the brain to interpret social situations more accurately and realistically, which then makes positive social experiences possible again. But cognitive interventions work best when combined with what therapists call behavioral activation, gradually increasing engagement in meaningful activities that provide opportunities for positive social contact and personal accomplishment. The key insight here is that not all social activities are equally effective for addressing loneliness. Large group events where interaction remains superficial, competitive social situations that trigger social comparison and self-consciousness, and activities that are primarily focused on entertainment rather than meaningful engagement may actually increase loneliness by highlighting someone's sense of disconnection and social inadequacy. The most helpful activities are those that involve working alongside others toward shared goals, provide opportunities to contribute unique skills or knowledge, and create natural contexts for gradual relationship building without the pressure of forced socialization. This is why volunteer activities have proven to be among the most effective interventions for loneliness across diverse populations. When someone joins a literacy program to teach adults how to read, participates in environmental restoration projects, or helps serve meals at a homeless shelter, they experience what researchers call purpose-driven social interaction. The focus is on accomplishing meaningful work rather than on social performance or impression management, which reduces self-consciousness and anxiety while providing natural opportunities for connection with like-minded others. Volunteer activities also provide what psychologists call helper's high, the neurochemical reward that comes from contributing to others' well-being, which can counteract some of the neurological changes associated with chronic loneliness. Group therapy approaches specifically designed for loneliness have also shown remarkable effectiveness, but they work differently than most people might expect. The therapeutic power comes not from the simple fact of being in a group with other people, but from the opportunity to discover that the thoughts and feelings associated with loneliness are shared experiences rather than evidence of personal inadequacy. When group members share their automatic negative thoughts about social situations, they often find themselves able to see clearly how distorted and unrealistic these thoughts are when they hear them expressed by others, even though the same thoughts feel completely rational and justified when experienced privately. This mutual reality testing helps people develop what therapists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to step back from their thoughts and evaluate them objectively rather than simply accepting them as accurate descriptions of reality. One of the most innovative approaches to treating loneliness involves what researchers call attention training, or mindfulness-based interventions. These approaches recognize that chronic loneliness is associated with particular patterns of attention that maintain social anxiety and negative thinking. Lonely people tend to focus disproportionately on internal sensations like anxiety, self-critical thoughts, and worries about how others perceive them, while paying less attention to external social cues that might indicate interest, acceptance, or opportunities for connection. Mindfulness practices can help people learn to redirect their attention away from internal rumination and toward present-moment awareness of what is actually happening in social situations, which often reveals that their fears and negative assumptions are not supported by observable evidence. The most promising new research in treating loneliness involves combining individual therapy with what researchers call social prescribing. Systematic efforts to connect people with community resources and activities that address both their social needs and their desire for meaningful engagement. Instead of simply telling someone to join social groups or make more friends, social prescribing involves careful assessment of someone's interests, values, and capabilities, followed by thoughtful matching with specific community opportunities that are likely to provide both social connection and personal fulfillment. This might involve connecting an isolated retiree with opportunities to mentor young people in their area of expertise, linking someone struggling with depression to peer support groups where they can both receive and provide emotional support, or helping someone discover community organizations that need their particular skills and knowledge. The approach recognizes that sustainable healing from loneliness requires not just social connection, but social contribution, opportunities to feel needed and valuable rather than simply accepted or tolerated. Part 10. The Digital Paradox: How Technology Promises Connection but delivers isolation. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a family at a restaurant, each member absorbed in their own glowing screen, thumbs moving frantically across keyboards as they communicate with people who are not present, while ignoring the humans sitting directly across from them. This scene, which would have been impossible to imagine just 2 decades ago, has become so commonplace that we barely notice it anymore. But it represents something profound about how digital technology has transformed the fundamental nature of human social experience. We are living through the most radical transformation of human communication and relationship in our species' history, a change so rapid and comprehensive that we have barely begun to understand its implications for our psychological, social, and spiritual well-being. The devices that promise to bring us closer together may actually be driving us further apart in ways that are contributing significantly to the loneliness epidemic we are experiencing today. The statistics about technology use and loneliness are striking and deeply concerning. 73% of people surveyed identified technology as contributing to loneliness in America, making it the most commonly cited factor in social isolation. But the relationship between technology and loneliness is more complex and paradoxical than these numbers might suggest. The same devices that allow us to maintain relationships across vast distances, stay connected with friends and family members we might otherwise lose touch with, and find communities of people who share our interests and experiences, are also creating new forms of social disconnection that may be more profound and damaging than the isolation that existed before digital communication became ubiquitous. Consider the experience of Marcus, a 24-year-old recent college graduate who moved to San Francisco for his first job in the tech industry. He spends most of his waking hours connected to digital networks, communicating constantly through Slack with colleagues, maintaining active profiles on Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn, participating in online gaming communities, dating through apps like Tinder and Bumble, and staying in touch with college friends through group texts and video calls. By any quantitative measure, Marcus is highly connected, sending and receiving hundreds of digital communications each day, maintaining ongoing relationships with dozens of people across multiple platforms, and engaging in various forms of social interaction from morning until night. Yet he reports feeling more lonely and disconnected than he has ever felt in his life, describing his existence as surrounded by people but completely alone. From the outside, Marcus's loneliness might seem paradoxical or even self-indulgent. How can someone who is constantly communicating with others claim to feel isolated? But his experience reveals something crucial about the difference between digital communication and the kind of embodied, present-moment encounter that humans evolved to need for psychological and emotional well-being. Most of Marcus's social interactions happen through interfaces that reduce the complexity and richness of human communication to text, images, and brief video exchanges that lack the subtle nonverbal cues, physical presence, and sustained attention that characterize face-to-face relationship. He can maintain the illusion of social connection while avoiding the vulnerability, unpredictability, and emotional intensity that genuine intimacy requires. The design of digital communication platforms may actually encourage forms of interaction that simulate intimacy while preventing its development. Social media platforms are engineered to maximize user engagement through what technology critics call persuasive design. Features like infinite scroll, variable reward schedules, and social comparison mechanisms that trigger the same neurological responses as gambling and other forms of behavioral addiction. These platforms profit from keeping users engaged for as long as possible, which means they are designed to provide just enough social stimulation to feel rewarding, while ensuring that users never feel fully satisfied and always want to return for more. The result is a kind of social junk food that provides temporary pleasure and stimulation while failing to deliver the deep nourishment that comes from sustained, authentic human relationship. The asynchronous nature of most digital communication also fundamentally alters the rhythm and quality of human interaction in ways that may undermine intimacy and emotional connection. When we communicate through text messages, emails, or social media posts, we can carefully craft our responses, edit our thoughts, and present curated versions of ourselves that may bear little resemblance to our actual moment-to-moment experience. This ability to control and manage our self-presentation might seem advantageous, but it actually prevents the kind of spontaneous, unguarded interaction that allows people to know each other authentically and develop genuine trust and intimacy. We become skilled at performing versions of ourselves that we think others will find attractive or acceptable. while losing touch with our own authentic thoughts, feelings and responses to others. The constant availability of digital distraction also interferes with our capacity for the kind of sustained attention and presence that deep relationship requires. When we know that we can always escape an uncomfortable moment by checking our phones, scrolling through social media, or responding to notifications, we lose the tolerance for emotional intensity and interpersonal challenge that allows relationships to deepen over time. Face-to-face conversations that might naturally include moments of silence, emotional vulnerability, or interpersonal tension get interrupted by the impulse to check devices or seek digital stimulation, preventing the kind of sustained engagement that allows people to work through difficulties and develop genuine intimacy. We become accustomed to constant stimulation and immediate gratification in ways that make the slower, more uncertain process of relationship building feel boring or anxiety-provoking. Digital technology also creates new forms of social comparison and status anxiety that can exacerbate feelings of loneliness and inadequacy. Social media platforms present carefully curated highlights from other people's lives, creating the illusion that everyone else is having more fun, achieving more success, and enjoying better relationships than we are. This social comparison is particularly toxic because it compares our internal experience, including all of our doubts, struggles and private disappointments, with others' external presentations of their best moments and greatest achievements. The result is a systematic distortion of social reality that makes most people feel inadequate and left out, even when their own lives are objectively satisfying and their relationships are generally positive. Young people who have grown up with digital technology as their primary mode of social interaction may be particularly vulnerable to these effects. Research shows that rates of loneliness, depression and social anxiety have increased dramatically among teenagers and young adults since the widespread adoption of smartphones and social media, with the highest rates occurring among those who spend the most time engaged in digital communication. These young people may have hundreds of online connections while lacking experience in the kind of face-to-face social interaction that builds confidence, empathy, and interpersonal skills. They may be highly skilled at digital communication while feeling anxious and incompetent in situations that require spontaneous, unmediated human interaction. But technology is not inherently antisocial or damaging to human relationship. The same digital tools that can increase isolation can also be used to facilitate genuine connection when they are designed and used thoughtfully. Video calling platforms allow families separated by geography to maintain close relationships across vast distances. Online communities provide support and understanding for people dealing with rare medical conditions or unusual life circumstances, and social media can help people organize collective action around shared values and concerns. The key difference seems to be whether digital technology is used as a supplement to face-to-face relationship or as a substitute for it, whether it enhances our capacity for genuine human encounter or replaces it with simulated forms of connection that provide temporary satisfaction while increasing long-term isolation. Some of the most promising approaches to addressing technology-related loneliness involve what researchers call digital wellness, or mindful technology use. This approach recognizes that completely avoiding digital technology is neither possible nor desirable for most people, but that learning to use these tools more intentionally and selectively can reduce their isolating effects while preserving their benefits. Digital wellness practices might include setting specific times for checking messages and social media rather than allowing constant interruption throughout the day, prioritizing video calls over text-based communication when possible, using technology to facilitate in-person meetings rather than replace them, and regularly taking breaks from digital devices to engage in activities that require sustained attention and presence. The goal is not to eliminate technology from our lives, but to ensure that our use of these tools serves our deeper human needs for authentic connection and meaningful engagement rather than substituting artificial stimulation for genuine relationship. Part 11. Rebuilding the social fabric. Community solutions for a collective crisis. There is a small town in Denmark called Helsingør where something remarkable happened that offers profound insights into how communities can address loneliness at a systemic level, rather than simply treating it as an individual problem requiring individual solutions. In the early 2000s, local officials noticed that growing numbers of elderly residents were dying alone in their apartments, sometimes going undiscovered for days or weeks because they had lost touch with neighbours, family members and community networks that might have provided support and human contact. Rather than simply expanding professional social services or encouraging individuals to be more socially active, the town decided to fundamentally redesign how community life was organized to ensure that social connection became woven into the basic infrastructure of daily existence. They created what they called lifelong neighborhoods, where housing, services, transportation and public spaces were designed specifically to promote ongoing interaction and mutual support among residents of all ages and backgrounds. The Danish approach recognized something crucial that is often missing from American discussions of loneliness. While individual therapy, social skills training, and personal behavior change can be helpful for people experiencing chronic isolation, the loneliness epidemic is fundamentally a collective problem that requires collective solutions. When survey data shows that 75% of adults want more activities and fun community events as well as public spaces that are more accessible and connection-focused, like green spaces and playgrounds, they are identifying a need that cannot be met through individual effort alone. Creating the social infrastructure that makes authentic human connection possible requires coordinated action by communities, institutions and governments that recognize social connection as a public good deserving of public investment and attention. Consider what has happened to the physical and social infrastructure that historically supported human connection in American communities over the past 50 years. Neighborhood schools where parents naturally encountered each other during drop-off and pick-up have been replaced by large regional institutions that require car transportation and offer fewer opportunities for casual interaction among families. Local businesses where people developed relationships with shopkeepers and regularly encountered neighbors have been displaced by chain stores and online shopping that prioritize efficiency over social interaction. Town squares, community centres and public gathering spaces have been replaced by private spaces like shopping malls and entertainment complexes where social interaction is discouraged and commercial transaction is the primary purpose. Even religious institutions, which historically served as crucial hubs of community connection, regardless of theological beliefs, have seen dramatic declines in participation and social influence. The result is that many American communities lack what sociologist Robert Putnam calls social capital, the networks of relationships and shared norms that allow people to work together effectively and provide mutual support during times of need. Without social capital, individuals become more vulnerable to isolation, stress, and various forms of personal crisis because they lack the informal safety nets that historically helped people navigate life's challenges and transitions. Children grow up without learning how to participate in community life. Adults struggle to find meaning and purpose beyond their immediate family and career concerns, and elderly people face old age without the intergenerational relationships that historically provided dignity and continued social role throughout the lifespan. The breakdown of social capital affects everyone, but it hits particularly hard those who are already vulnerable due to poverty, disability, mental illness, or other circumstances that make it difficult to create social connections through individual effort alone. But communities across the country are beginning to experiment with innovative approaches to rebuilding social infrastructure that can address loneliness at its roots. In Portland, Oregon, a program called Village Building Convergence brings together neighbors to work on shared projects like community gardens, little free libraries, and neighborhood gathering spaces that create ongoing opportunities for relationship building while addressing practical community needs. The genius of this approach is that it gives people legitimate reasons to interact with neighbors beyond simply socializing, reducing the social anxiety and artificiality that can make forced community-building efforts feel awkward or unsuccessful. When people work together to solve shared problems or create shared amenities, relationships develop naturally through the process of collaboration rather than through the more difficult and vulnerable process of directly seeking personal connection. Housing design and urban planning can also play crucial roles in either facilitating or preventing the kind of casual social interaction that builds community connection over time. Traditional neighborhood design, with front porches, sidewalks, mixed-use development, and public spaces within walking distance, creates numerous opportunities for residents to encounter each other during the normal course of daily life. Suburban development patterns that prioritize privacy, car dependence, and separation of residential from commercial areas, by contrast, can make it difficult for neighbors to meet each other even when they are interested in forming relationships. Some communities are experimenting with co-housing developments where residents have private living spaces but share common areas like kitchens, gardens, and recreational facilities that create natural opportunities for ongoing interaction and mutual support. Intergenerational programs represent another promising approach to addressing loneliness while simultaneously addressing other community needs. Programs that connect isolated elderly people with busy families, pair older adults with children who need tutoring or mentoring, or create shared housing arrangements between college students and seniors, can address loneliness across multiple age groups while building the kind of intergenerational relationships that strengthen entire communities. These programs recognize that different age groups have complementary needs and resources, that children benefit from relationships with caring adults beyond their immediate family members, that young adults often need practical support and wisdom from older generations, and that elderly people have knowledge, experience, and time that can contribute significantly to community well-being when properly organized and supported. The key is creating structures that facilitate genuine relationship building rather than simply organizing services where one group helps another without developing ongoing personal connections. Workplace culture and policies can also contribute significantly to either alleviating or exacerbating the loneliness epidemic. Companies that prioritize employee well-being, create opportunities for social interaction among colleagues, offer flexible schedules that allow people to maintain relationships outside of work, and support employee participation in community activities can help their workers develop and maintain the social connections that contribute to both personal satisfaction and professional effectiveness. By contrast, Workplace cultures that demand excessive hours, discourage personal relationships among colleagues, or treat employees as interchangeable resources rather than whole human beings with lives and relationships outside of work, can contribute to social isolation even among people who are surrounded by colleagues throughout the day. Some companies are beginning to experiment with policies like volunteer time off, team-building activities that involve community service, and employee resource groups that help workers with shared interests or backgrounds connect with each other in meaningful ways. Public policy at local, state and federal levels can also play important roles in creating conditions that support social connection and community building. Investment in public transportation, parks, libraries, community centres and other shared spaces provides the infrastructure that makes community life possible for people who cannot rely solely on private resources and personal networks. Policies that support local businesses, encourage mixed-use development and preserve affordable housing in established neighbourhoods can help maintain the stability and diversity that allow communities to develop deep roots and ongoing relationships over time. Mental health and social services that are embedded in community settings rather than isolated in clinical environments can address individual needs while simultaneously strengthening community capacity for mutual support and shared problem-solving. Perhaps most importantly, addressing the loneliness epidemic at a community level requires recognizing that social connection is not a luxury or personal preference, but a fundamental human need that affects public health, economic productivity, educational outcomes, and social stability. Just as communities invest in clean water, safe roads and basic education because these are recognized as essential to community well-being, we need to begin investing in social infrastructure that supports human relationship and community connection. This means going beyond individual treatments for loneliness to create communities where social connection is supported, valued, and integrated into the basic structures of daily life. When we do this successfully, loneliness becomes less likely to develop in the first place, and when it does occur, communities have the resources and relationships necessary to address it before it becomes chronic and debilitating. Part 12. The Path Forward, Reclaiming Our Humanity in an Age of Disconnection. As we reach the end of our exploration into the loneliness epidemic, it becomes clear that we are not simply dealing with a health crisis or a social problem, but with a fundamental challenge to what it means to be human in the 21st century. The forces that have created this epidemic, technology that promises connection while delivering isolation, economic systems that prioritize individual achievement over community well-being, cultural narratives that celebrate independence while ignoring our fundamental interdependence. These are not temporary glitches in an otherwise functioning society. They represent deep structural features of modern life that require not just individual adaptation, but collective transformation if we are to create conditions where authentic human relationship can flourish again. The path forward requires nothing less than a fundamental reimagining of how we organize social life, how we understand human nature, and what we consider to be the essential elements of a life worth living. The philosophical insights we have explored throughout this investigation point toward a common understanding that may seem radical in our individualistic culture, but represents ancient wisdom about human nature. We are not isolated individuals who happen to need relationships for practical or emotional benefits, but fundamentally relational beings whose very capacity for consciousness, meaning, and identity emerges from our encounters with others. Sartre's insight that we are condemned to be free, reveals that our choices about how to relate to others are not optional lifestyle preferences, but existential decisions that determine who we become as human beings. Levinas's recognition that we are called into ethical responsibility by the face of the other suggests that our deepest fulfillment comes not from being understood and accepted, but from responding generously to the needs and reality of those we encounter. Buber's distinction between I-it and I-thou relationships shows us that genuine connection requires a quality of presence and attention that cannot be achieved through technique or strategy, but only through the willingness to encounter others in their full mystery and complexity. Heidegger's concept of being with reminds us that our individual existence is always already embedded in networks of relationship that extend far beyond our immediate social circle, connecting us to communities of meaning that span generations and cultures. Arendt's vision of plurality reveals that we need not just personal relationships, but public spaces where we can act together with others to address shared concerns and demonstrate our unique contributions to the human community. Together, these philosophical perspectives suggest that healing the loneliness epidemic requires more than helping individuals develop better social skills or providing more opportunities for social interaction. It requires creating cultural conditions that support the kind of authentic encounter between free subjects that allows people to experience their fundamental interconnectedness while developing their unique identities and capabilities. The scientific research we have examined reveals the biological and psychological mechanisms through which loneliness damages human health and well-being, but it also points toward interventions that can be remarkably effective when they address the deeper cognitive and social patterns that maintain chronic isolation. The most successful treatments are those that help people recognize and change the automatic negative thoughts that make genuine connection feel impossible, while simultaneously providing opportunities for meaningful engagement with others in contexts that reduce social anxiety and self-consciousness. These interventions work not by forcing people to socialize more, but by helping them rediscover their capacity for authentic presence and generous attention to others, qualities that make them more attractive as friends and companions, while providing the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from genuine human encounter. The key insight is that loneliness is maintained not primarily by external circumstances, but by internal patterns of thinking and behaving that can be changed through sustained effort and appropriate support. But individual healing, while crucial, is not sufficient to address an epidemic that affects millions of people across all age groups and social categories. The community-level interventions that show the most promise are those that rebuild social infrastructure, creating physical and social environments that support ongoing relationship building rather than simply providing temporary opportunities for social contact. This means designing communities where people naturally encounter each other during the course of daily life, where intergenerational relationships can develop organically, where people have opportunities to contribute their unique skills and knowledge to shared projects, and where social connection is valued and supported rather than treated as a private responsibility that individuals must manage on their own. It means recognizing that social capital is as important to community well-being as physical infrastructure, and investing accordingly in the institutions, spaces and programs that allow people to develop and maintain meaningful relationships over time. The role of technology in either exacerbating or alleviating loneliness depends entirely on how we choose to design and use these powerful tools. Digital communication can supplement and enhance face-to-face relationship when it is used mindfully and selectively, but it becomes harmful when it substitutes artificial stimulation for genuine human encounter. The most promising approaches to digital wellness involve using technology to facilitate in-person meetings, support existing relationships, and connect people with communities of shared interest or concern, while avoiding the constant distraction and social comparison that makes sustained attention and authentic presence more difficult to achieve. This requires both individual discipline in how we use digital devices and collective action to demand that technology companies design platforms that support human flourishing rather than simply maximizing user engagement and corporate profit. Perhaps most importantly, addressing the loneliness epidemic requires a fundamental shift in cultural values, away from the celebration of radical individualism toward recognition of our profound interdependence and mutual responsibility for each other's well-being. This does not mean abandoning personal freedom or individual achievement, but rather understanding that these can only be meaningful and sustainable when they occur within contexts of genuine community and mutual support. We need to develop what might be called a relational individualism that honors both personal uniqueness and social connection, that recognizes individual fulfillment and community well-being as complementary rather than competing values. This cultural transformation requires changes in how we raise children, organize workplaces, design communities, structure economic systems, and understand the fundamental purposes of human life. The loneliness epidemic will not be solved by any single intervention or policy change, but by thousands of small decisions made by individuals, families, communities and institutions to prioritize authentic human relationship over efficiency, convenience and private accumulation. It will be solved by parents who choose to limit their children's screen time and create opportunities for unstructured play with other children, by employers who recognize that supporting their workers' social connections serves both human and business interests, by urban planners who design neighborhoods that encourage casual interaction rather than efficient traffic flow, by individuals who choose presence over productivity in their daily interactions with others. Every choice we make about how to spend our time and attention either contributes to the conditions that support genuine human connection or reinforces the patterns of distraction and isolation that characterize contemporary life. In this sense, healing the loneliness epidemic is not primarily a technical or policy challenge, but a moral and spiritual one that calls each of us to examine our deepest assumptions about what makes life meaningful and worthwhile. The philosopher Martin Buber once wrote that all real living is meeting, and this simple statement may contain the key to understanding both the nature of our current crisis and the path toward healing. We have created a civilization that provides unprecedented opportunities for comfort, entertainment, information, and individual achievement, but that systematically undermines the conditions that make genuine meeting between human beings possible. Healing the loneliness epidemic requires not just addressing its symptoms, but rediscovering what it means to live in ways that prioritize meeting, encounter, and authentic relationship as the fundamental sources of meaning and fulfillment in human life. This is both our greatest challenge and our most hopeful possibility, the chance to create communities where every person can experience the profound satisfaction that comes from being truly seen, known, and valued by others, while simultaneously contributing their unique gifts to the ongoing project of creating a world worthy of our shared humanity. The loneliness epidemic is not an inevitable feature of modern life, but a call to remember and reclaim the relational foundations of human existence. When we answer this call, we discover that the cure for loneliness is not simply finding people who will accept us as we are, but learning to encounter others with the kind of generous attention and authentic presence that reveals our fundamental interconnectedness. In choosing authentic relationship over artificial connection, presence over productivity, and community well-being over individual accumulation, we not only heal our own loneliness, but contribute to the healing of a world that desperately needs to remember what it means to be human together. This is our work, our calling, and our greatest hope for creating a future where no one has to suffer the profound pain of feeling fundamentally alone in a world full of potential companions.